Welcome to the Injustice Anywhere podcast.
This week we'll be discussing the debate surrounding shaken baby syndrome, or SBS, with our guest Audrey Edmunds and attorney Jen Fitzgerald. New scientific evidence has come to light in recent years challenging the validity of SBS, calling into question many convictions that may have been secured on flawed science. According to Jerry Mitchell from the Clarion Ledger, thousands of Americans are currently behind bars convicted of shaking babies to death. Audrey Edmunds was wrongfully convicted in 1996 of reckless homicide for the shaking death of Natalie Beard, a 7-month-old infant she was watching while doing home daycare. Audrey was sentenced to 18 years in prison. Thankfully, her case was overturned in 2008, but sadly, she served 11 years in prison before her case was overturned. Audrey is the co-author of the book, It Happened to Audrey, a terrifying journey from loving mom to accused baby killer. That book is available on Amazon.com, and I recommend it to all of our listeners. Jen Fitzgerald is a frequent guest on the show. Jen is an outstanding attorney that we are proud to have as a member of our advisory board. She is also the spokesperson for Jeffrey Habbard, one of our current featured cases that also deals with SBS. We will be taking calls in the final segment of the show, so please call 347-850-1478. That's 347-850-1478 with any questions or comments for our guests. Generally, we take calls after 8:30. I would like to now introduce our guest to the show. Hi, Audrey. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Bruce. Thank you very much for inviting me.
We're very happy to have you. Hi, Jen. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, Bruce. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here again. We always appreciate it. Now, Audrey, I'd like to get started with your story because it's a very compelling case. It's a tragic case. In 1995, you were a young married woman raising a family in Wisconsin when this all began. Can you tell us a little bit about your life at that time?
My life was very good. I was a stay-at-home mother. I had 2 children at the time, and I was pregnant with my 3rd child. I was married at the time, and we were in the process of moving back to the Twin Cities due to my then-husband's job. We had wanted to get back to the Twin Cities area as much as we really liked where we were living in Wanakee. I was very fortunate, as I said, to be a stay-at-home mom. I loved kids. I lived in a neighborhood with lots and lots of kids, so I was really active with my kids and other kids, doing helping others in daycare and just playing with other kids outside and hanging out with young moms like myself.
And you did home daycare for neighborhood children as well?
That's correct. That's correct. I didn't have any full-time children, but I had a lot of people when they were in need of daycare. They would call me, and I would help out when I could. And I had a couple, as Natalie was, that just came part-time.
And this was a way for you to be able to stay home with your children as well?
Yes, it sure was. Stay home and help them out.
Now, the infant that died, she was a part-time care for you?
I had her 3 days a week, and she had not been in my care since that previous Wednesday. And then she came on a Monday morning. She'd been ill during the weekend. They had taken her to the doctor. She'd been up and sick during the night. She had projectile vomited at home in the morning in her car seat. She had not taken her bottle, and they brought her to my house.
So they brought an ill child to your home. And the child had only been at your house for, from what I read, for just about an hour before her health declined?
That's exactly correct. That's when I noticed she was choking on some formula, and I thought it was because I had put a propped-up bottle by her. As I had tried for several minutes after her mom had left the house, I continued to try to feed her because she hadn't taken her normal feeding at home that morning. And I'm a mom, and I know that a 7-month-old baby is hungry, even if, as Natalie had, she had taken a bottle at midnight, but here it is, 8 o'clock in the morning. She should be hungry, and she wasn't. She was having real difficulties feeding, but I thought that would help pacify her and settle her down.
Now, as soon as you saw the health decline, you called 911 and were right off to the emergency room.
I did immediately. I picked her up. I zipped through the house. I ran outside to yell at one of the neighbor moms, and she came down, and I quickly told her what was going on. She said, "You need to get in and call 911, which is exactly what I did. And then they helped me as I started CPR. Then the police came, then the ambulance, and then med-flight helicopter came.
Now, at that time, shaken baby syndrome was considered fact by the public. It was in the news quite often. Confirmation bias was at an all-time high at that time. Do you feel there was essentially a witch hunt with regard to SBS at that time?
Definitely, yes. It was a very, very narrow-minded witch hunt, and they always wanted to say that the last person with the child, when it declined with those symptoms, that definitely had to be the perpetrator.
Now, Jen, is that generally still today the assumed belief that the last person with the child must have caused the injuries to that child? Is that still the misconception?
Well, essentially, yes. What's interesting is that that's, generally speaking, how they sort of focus in on a particular person as being their suspect. It's usually not by virtue of reported prior instances of abuse or because the person was particularly angry that day or because they, were frustrated or something like that. It's usually the child presents with, as Audrey has just described, vomiting and lethargy and that kind of thing, and they see what they believe to be this triad of symptoms, these three, specific symptoms, and they sort of backtrack and they say, well, okay, it lands on this guy right here. He was the last person that had the child in their custody and alone in their custody. And so you're just kind of left standing there holding the bag. And we're now, through medical advancements, have realized that there's no rhyme or reason to that. Certainly a child could have suffered an injury even days before really presenting, and so that's sort of what lands somebody in the hot seat.
But sadly, we still see prosecutors putting the blinders on and pushing forward when that triad of symptoms is present.
I think it's not just prosecutors that are putting the blinders on. I think that there are some members of the medical community that are. It's kind of like this SBS diagnosis or theory has sort of been so ingrained that it's sort of people are resistant to change. I don't know, but there's definitely medical experts on one side of the fence and medical experts on the other, and they just can't seem to come to, at least right now, the state of the evidence, any sort of agreement. And that's sort of the problem when you present that to a jury, when you've got doctors that can't agree, and the entire case is based on medical testimony. It's hard to really rectify how you can ask a jury to decide beyond a reasonable doubt which one of those doctors is right.
The two main things in mind was that there was a new subdural hematoma and that there was the retinal folds, the retinal centesis. And one of the great things that happened in my case was the coroner did a case on a baby a few months older than the child in my care. In 1999, the coroner did a case where this baby had died, and she had retinal damage, the same as the case in my situation. And this child had been in the doctor's care at the University of Madison Hospital for 18 hours with a skull fracture and broken bones.
Wow.
So that child had been abused.
Right.
And yet it took 18 hours for these symptoms to manifest. And that's one of the things that the medical community, some of the medical community is not looking up to. The second thing in my case, too, was they did not look at the age or the location of the subdural. The subdural was connected to an older one. The newer one could have been up to a week old, and it was not in a location to cause anything that could have happened to the baby, as they said did happen. They're figuring what caused the retinal damage in my case was due to the fact that she was in lack of oxygen for so many minutes before they got the heart rate back up, and that causes retinal centesis. That and many, many other things causes that.
Did they ever learn what the reason was that she had a pre-existing subdural? Was it a traumatic birth or something like that?
They never did, because they did so little accurate research, because they saw these two symptoms and they immediately said, this is it.
And there was no other reason to,
Yes, many of the doctors are saying now, as they're talking more about misdiagnosed abuse cases, is that you've got to look into all the medical history.
Right.
And they did not do that in my case.
Now, when they brought you in for questioning, were they immediately demanding an explanation from you on how the baby was injured?
Absolutely not. It seemed much more general than that. It was 3 hours just of talking about what happened, what was going on in my life, my past. I had no clue at that time that I could possibly be a suspect for the death of this baby. No, they didn't.
Okay, so there was no hard pressure questioning trying to get you to admit that you committed the crime.
Lengthy. Yes, even though it was lengthy and I had an attorney sitting with me at the time. This happened on Monday, and I went for questioning on Wednesday.
Okay, so it was based purely on the science of that time. They based it purely on the symptoms of the infant that they believed fit the current beliefs of that time. That was 100% how your conviction occurred.
Yes, and the first autopsy, the first page of the first autopsy said it due to the confined bleeding in the brain, it was a very, very small area, and other factors, it was highly argumentative that it was any type of abuse. And then he did another autopsy weeks later.
It's one of our featured cases, the Jeffrey Havard case, deals with shaken baby syndrome. The infant in that case actually died from a short fall while being taken out of a tub. And in that case, during his questioning, they were demanding an explanation from him. They wanted to know exactly what happened. In that case, also, he was wrongfully accused of sexual assault because of anal dilation. So they have him in a room. They're demanding to know how this anal dilation occurred and demanding to know what he did. And, of course, he had no answers. He was confused. He was blindsided by these statements.
Yes.
So after a few hours of questioning, he comes up with an explanation. Well, maybe I wiped her too hard when I was changing her diaper or drying her off. And, of course, that's used against him in the future. So I was just curious how the questioning went on your case.
It was very hard when they cross-examined me during my trial. Mm-hmm. It was very difficult then.
But they didn't demand that you make any sort of. Were they asking you, like, were you angry? Was she crying? They weren't insinuating when they were questioning you?
No. Wow. No. Wow. And one of the biggest things that they did at that time was when the investigator wrote her reports after I had met with her, and then I got the reports after I had been charged, she had said several times that I had said the baby's eyes were tracking, and I never said that. They never even talked about it. And like my attorney said during trial, what are babies doing when they're crying? Their eyes are not wide open, and you're holding on to them, patting onto their back.
Right.
And then they had said another dad that had brought his daughter right after Natalie had been dropped off. They said that he had seen Natalie as she was following large objects around the room. He never went into the room where she was. So at that time, they were really focusing on eye tracking, and it's never come up since because it doesn't matter.
It's amazing to me. Your case was based solely on the science believed at the time. They didn't base it on anything due to your behavior. There was no outlying accusation whatsoever, just the science that is now being posed as faulty.
Truth. Yep, they didn't want truth. They wanted blame, and it's very, very, very sad, but they've never dealt with the realistic point of view. And anybody can think if some child was injured that badly, there has to be neck damage, spinal damage, rib damage, much more bleeding around the brain, and there was none of that.
Do you feel that the media played any role in your wrongful conviction? Did the media turn on you locally?
No, the media was and still is very neutral with me. The last 2 Sundays, the Madison newspaper has covered more articles about wrongful shaken baby cases, and they have used my case in there.
What was the first thing that led to the break in your case? Because I know your first several appeals failed. What was it that led to the break in your case that eventually led to your freedom?
There was a neurologist at the UW-Madison Hospital, one of the senior neurologists, who knew about my case. And he always knew it was a wrongful conviction. And the day after I was found guilty, he even called my trial attorney. My trial attorney said to me, Audrey, if I had the medical information during the trial that I do now, we would have never gotten this verdict. And I'm sitting looking like, what are we going to do? Well, this gentleman, then this doctor, several years later, was at a function with Keith Finley from the Innocence Project, and he talked to them about my case and about the medical misdoings with my case that he knew about. And then the Innocence Project took it on after my appeals were exhausted. And then at that time, The coroner was very, very cooperative. He said he knew it was wrong and he was willing to help do what was right. And then as the Innocence Project did more and more medical research, they saw more doctors, the Patrick Barnes, the John Galasniks, and many others that used to say, well, yes, 15 years ago this is it, and now it's not because of these factors, not opinions.
So how many years had gone by before that break for you came?
Almost 7.
7 years, and then it took another 4 years.
Yes, exactly.
It's such a long
process. Yes.
When you went into prison,
so quick to convict. Yes.
Absolutely. When you went into prison, you had 3 young children, and you were married at the time.
I was incarcerated 2 days after my baby daughter's first birthday, and today was her last day of high school. She graduates on Thursday.
Oh, congratulations.
Well, congratulations.
Yes.
We just had our daughter just graduated from high school as well.
It's exciting.
Now, that must have just been absolutely devastating on your family at that time. How did you possibly cope with it?
There's still, you coped with it with faith and hope, but it hurts. You know, I can't dwell on it, or it would just tear me up every day. And I can't, like I say, I can't dwell in it. It hurts. We just have to make the best of it. And the first 5.5 years, I saw my children a lot. Even though I was 4.5 hours away from them, they used to come with their dad and my parents and other friends and family almost every weekend. And then during holiday breaks for school, because my oldest daughter was in kindergarten at the time this happened, they used to come and spend a lot of time with me. So that was very, very beneficial to all of us. My kids have always known what was going on.
And they've known, obviously, they were young at the time, but as they grew older, they knew that you had been wrongfully convicted.
Yes, they have been great little alibis for me and advocates. And when I came home, I went right to their schools and had lunch with them and went to some of their classes, and their friends were very kind and supportive, and that's because of the way that they handled it, and I'm very, very thankful for that.
That's great to hear. So your relationship with your kids is great.
It is, yes, thank you.
That's great to hear. I don't think people realize how many people are affected by wrongful convictions. It just destroys families. It's one thing if you committed the crime and you're going to prison for a crime that you committed. It's another thing completely when you're innocent. And there are so many victims created, additional victims with these wrongful convictions. And that's why I asked you questions about your family, because people really need to know how important it is to get these cases right. Because getting it wrong in a trial that goes so quickly takes 10, 12, 15 years to correct, if it's ever corrected. Because your case was really corrected, a year before you were going to be released anyway, was it not?
Exactly. Yep, that's right. That's exactly right. Yep, and now, we've got Dr. Kelch, who put this together in 1971. He came forward to almost 3 years ago with the paperwork, he and the other doctor that put this together, saying that due to all the new medical and scientific evidence, SBS does not exist anymore, and he is a very good advocate in trying to help overturn wrongful convictions. Granted, the gentleman now is in his late 90s, but he is still speaking out and publishing articles.
We have a link that Jen provided on the freejeffreyhavard.org website. Jen sent me that a few months back. That's on the front page of freejeffreyhavard.org if people would like to read up on that.
Good. Very good information.
Now, as the state of Wisconsin, have you been compensated in any way for your wrongful conviction?
We have not. The state of Wisconsin has one of the worst compensations right now. They're working to get that improved so that myself and others who have been wrongfully convicted, there's almost 20 wrongful convictions now in the state of Wisconsin. And no, they haven't paid us for a penny. And it's tough, but I just have to keep plugging along and making the best and hoping and trusting as other things progress, this will also.
Have you received any apologies from anybody involved in this case?
The investigator was, the lead investigator was kind enough to confront my attorney shortly before I was released, and she did tell him that she wanted him to know that she was set up to do this and she was not seeking the truth. And that's the closest I've gotten to any kind of an apology.
Didn't the prosecution decide when they declined to testify to prosecute you after your conviction was overturned? I think that the reason that they cited to was that the child's parents didn't want to, understandably didn't want to go through prosecuting another trial and so forth, but there was never any sort of admission on the part of the state, to my understanding, that they had gotten it wrong, or that even that they might have gotten it wrong. Is that right?
You are exactly right, and they've done that with my case and many other of the Wisconsin exonerees, and that's why they're fighting so hard to get this compensation law, because even in some of the DNA cases that have point blank provided innocence to somebody, they're using the same excuse. Wisconsin can be so lame with that.
Right. Well, because prosecutors have the discretion to charge in the first instance or to recharge after somebody's conviction has been overturned. So I can only imagine how difficult it is to be on the receiving end of that when you've had your conviction overturned and then the prosecutor declines to prosecute. They can cite to whatever reason that they want to, but it almost sort of deprives you of an opportunity to prove your innocence. Not that, being acquitted is necessarily proving your innocence, but it's just kind of over. And, you've been out of...
very troublesome to me.
Right. And you've been out of society for 11 years, so there are a lot of people that aren't able to go out and get a job and sort of get reacclimated with society, and they don't have a means of income and so forth. So another reason why, certainly
you are
compensation
exactly right,
packages.
And I appreciate that. Yes, people on parole in Wisconsin get badger care, and they get apartment assistance, and they get job assistance, and people, when they get out because they've been exonerated, get nothing of that kind at all. And that
because
is
they're
so
not on parole, it's just, oops, and sometimes not even a sorry. So
you're exactly
it's
right.
It's completely unacceptable. And I know that there's several states. We have a list on our website on justice-anywhere.org listing the states that offer compensation and the states that don't. And many states in this country need reform in this regard, because so many people are not compensated.
Yes. People don't realize how quickly you can lose your home value, your pension, your job status, everything. And when I got out in 2008 and the recession was going on, and there were people much more qualified than me for different jobs, and they were looking and I am looking, and it was hard because there's still that ugly question on the many applications, too, that says, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And you can pull up my record right now, and it says no. But if you go back further into it, you can find that, yes, there once was a felony on my record, and that is just very troublesome.
Right.
Has there been an effort made to have your case expunged?
Yes, and that's a real difficult process in Wisconsin also. I've been trying to work on that with Keith Finley, my attorney.
Who is phenomenal.
I see many cases, it's years down the road, often sometimes even a decade before people are able to have that case expunged from their record, which to me is completely unacceptable once again. You've been exonerated, and that's still on your record. It makes absolutely no sense, and I can't believe that legislation has not been passed in all 50 states to correct that problem.
Thank you. I sure appreciate you bringing up that good point.
Now, I mentioned in the intro that you wrote a book on your story with author Jill Wellington. Was working on that book a positive experience for you?
Yes, it was. It's very good that I can inform more and more people about the wrongful convictions, about the rush to judgment rather than rush to find truth, and just enlightening to bring more and more information into the medical field and the scientific and medical field. That's what totally convicts me. I said it doesn't really matter what I did or didn't say happened, it's what the medical evidence proves. And so, yes, it's been very good. I've gone to many, many speaking events about that, and I'm just so thankful because I speak on my behalf and on everybody who has been wrongfully convicted. People don't realize how quickly it can happen to anyone.
The book is available on Amazon. The title is It Happened to Audrey, A Terrifying Journey from Loving Mom to Accused Baby Killer. Is that book also available in stores, or has it been out for a long period of time now?
It's in some Barnes & Noble stores. It's also available through barnesandnoble.com, and you can check on their website. Mostly it's stores in the Twin Cities area or down in Madison, Wisconsin, where I live.
Excellent. I saw there's a Kindle edition available also, so It's one click, and our listeners can read the book. So I highly recommend that everybody do that. Your story is one that people really need to listen to and they need to understand because, like you said, it could happen to anybody at any given time.
Yes.
Now, in the second half of the show here, I'd like to really get into the evidence that has come out in recent years that debunks SBS. What is it that came to light that really caused this raging debate that continues on between the medical field and science?
First of all, the several causes of subdural hematomas, of retinal damage, and just some of it is common sense too. If you shake a baby, there's got to be damage. They are very, very fragile. There's got to be damage to the axonal nerves that connect the brainstem to the neck. There's got to be rib problems or neck problems or something, and then it goes from there.
I think just to explain to maybe people that don't know a whole lot about shaken baby syndrome, that the science really, the way that people have been convicted has been that they find a classic triad of symptoms, one being a subdural hemorrhage or a subdural hematoma, which is bleeding on the brain, the other being retinal hemorrhages, which are hemorrhages that are in the eyes. Usually that can only be seen with a certain type of scope, and also that there be brain swelling, and that when you have these three symptoms and you don't have an explanation maybe from the caregiver that, like, we just got in a horrific car accident or, that kind of thing. When you don't have an adequate explanation, it's sort of a diagnosis by, I don't know, it's an exclusionary diagnosis, I think they call it, where they determine that, well, these three symptoms together can only mean that the child was shaken and you, the caregiver, must have shaken the child. Well, now we're learning that there are, an extraordinary amount of different natural diseases or accidental types of incidents that can cause these very same symptoms. And like Audrey was just explaining about the neck injuries and so forth, the reason why babies supposedly are why they suffer injuries from shaking, or so it was thought, is that the baby's head is much larger and disproportionate to the rest of the size of the body, and so the neck muscles and so forth haven't been fully developed, and so that the theory being that the head will when you violently shake a child flop all the way back and all the way front, and you're talking about a violent, just rageful type of shaking. The child's usually gripped underneath the arms, which accounts for rib fractures, and that if the whole movement that's causing the blood vessels to sort of to rip from the scalp or the skull is the head going back and forth, then it's common sense that there would be some sort of neck injury, some sort of, you're not going to have a perfectly intact neck. And what they're finding is that a lot of these cases where people have been convicted of shaken baby, there are no neck injuries, which is really frightening, which is really alarming, because that's the entire mechanism for how this supposedly happened. And so I think that what was happening for so long, for so many years, the late 80s, 90s, and early 2000 is they would see these classic triad of symptoms, and they'd say, oh, shaken baby syndrome. All right, we got our guy. Bring the person in, interrogate them. They won't admit it, or they admitted that they shook them when they're just talking about. Shaking is a wide range of actions. It could be just a little gentle shake to, kind of wake a kid up, to a violent shaking.
Right.
And then that's it. Case closed. They don't look at anything else. And I think that's what happened, in Audrey's case. It's certainly what happened in Jeffrey Havard's case. Jeffrey Havard, who's currently on death row for his wrongful conviction of it's unbelievable that you can put somebody on death row, which is the most final of all punishments, that has no room for error, when you've got a medical community that cannot agree among themselves, to a reasonable medical certainty whether or not this whole theory even exists.
Exactly. So how can untrained medical jurors try to find somebody guilty or not guilty?
Because ultimately, what it comes down to are these cases are based entirely upon medical testimony. So it's a battle of the experts. And many times, particularly in Mississippi, I've noticed, the trial courts are not allowing the defense to, when most of these defendants are indigent, they're not allotting funds for the defense to hire their own experts. So the defense is stuck with whatever expert the state puts on. So when you've got an expert saying it was shaken baby, and you don't have, I mean, I'm a lawyer, but I'm not a doctor, and I can't get up there and even begin to know everything the doctor knows. You're just stuck with it. You have no ability to defend yourself. And so the probability of there being a mistake somewhere along the line there is just, it's astronomical.
It is. And then what they say is the onset of the symptoms are immediate. So the person that sees the outcome of these symptoms has to be the perpetrator. That's why they always do the last person with it. They don't look at some of the symptoms and how it takes days, if not hours, to manifest. In my case, one of the doctors, Dr. John Golaznik, who is wonderful about testifying about the truth of these cases, he proved at how Natalie's body shut down, and it totally coincides with choking, and he shows how a baby's body shuts down, and if a child had been abused, and it does not fit at all.
Exactly. And if you don't have a doctor like that ready and willing to testify at your trial, it can mean the difference between being convicted and not being convicted, because a jury is simply going to take the word of the doctor. Who wouldn't? I would take the word of the doctor. He knows better. He's a doctor.
Now, as Jerry Mitchell reported, we have thousands of Americans currently behind bars convicted of shaken baby syndrome. Now, some of those cases, the people are clearly guilty because they showed other signs of abuse. It wasn't strictly SBS, but there are many cases that did not show any other symptoms. Are we just seeing a big circling in the wagons here, saving face with these experts because they do not want to admit a mistake because so many people have already been convicted?
Well, what I think that you bring up a really good point. The American Academy of Pediatrics years ago decided that we should not call it shaken baby syndrome anymore, that we should call it abusive head trauma. And because it is inflicted intentionally, according to people that ascribe to this theory. But what they are starting to realize is that what used to be the theory, which is shaking alone, that the caretaker becomes so frustrated that they just shake the child in a rage, and it's just the mechanism of that shaking that causes all of these injuries. Well, they're now realizing that shaking alone, through biomechanical science, a human being can't generate the types of, I think the G-force, they call it, to generate those kinds of damages. So they say, well, there must have been an impact, when it's kind of, it's such a circular argument, because if they're now changing it to, it must have been shaking and then at the end there was some kind of impact. Well, if the entire reason that you thought it was shaking is because you couldn't see any outward, indication that the child had hit her head on anything, and now you're saying it's shaking plus impact, there's no reason to keep the shaking. And so you find yourself in this vicious circle where they just don't want to, I guess, admit that, we were wrong about thinking that all these people lost their temper and shook these kids. And Jeffrey Havard's case being a perfect example, where he was convicted because they believed that he shook this child violently after he became, irritated and angry. And Jeff has maintained from day one that he was lifting her out of the tub. She slipped from his hands. She knocked her head on the porcelain toilet. There's a 6-centimeter contusion to the back of her head, which should have been a red flag that, wait a minute, what does the caretaker say in this case? Well, it doesn't appear that they ever told the pathologist what Jeff's version of the story was, and the child was diagnosed to have been shaken to death. Now that one medical expert has sort of recanted his testimony and said, I know it wasn't shaking alone, given the changing science, but I can't say whether it was shaking or shaking plus impact. And 5 other doctors, by the way, have national renown, Dr. Baden, Dr. Ophoven, experts, have all said this was not a shaken baby incident, and this is a man that's on death row. So as far as are they willing to admit that they've made mistakes, I think oftentimes they're not, or they're just not willing to really take an objective look at, you know, what they used to think and why that's changed.
I was talking to Audrey before the show, and I think there's a misconception with the public, because when I talk about this case, people look at me like I have 3 heads, and they say, don't tell me that you can't injure a child by shaking. And I think what the misconception is that we're talking about SBS with no other signs, because in order to shake the baby violently enough to cause that injury, you'd see massive other injuries on the child with the neck injuries or back. Something else would be present, because I think people write that off still today. Don't tell me you can't hurt a baby by shaking. I think we need to be much more clear about how other symptoms would be present.
Exactly.
Right. It's kind of like somebody's not going to, if the child was involved in a massive car crash, she might have the same injuries, but she's also going to have, you know, cuts and bruises and scrapes and broken bones from the car crash. You know, it's the same thing. You're going to have that from the shaking. You got to grip the child, and you have to really, I mean, it takes a lot of energy. I mean, I've seen some demonstrations that, you know, to really
I have too. I have
that.
too, and it just does not prove out at all. And that's why it's so horrible when the prosecution tries to say it's equivalent to a fall from a 2-story building. Anybody with any common sense knows that a 7-month-old child was dropped from a 2-story building. There was a major bone breakage, skull fracture, rotational acceleration, deceleration. There was none of that in my case.
Exactly, and there's none of that in most cases. Yes.
And that's what they try to point it out as.
And where there's an internal inconsistency there, because they're saying that the force it takes is like that from a 2-story fall, but then there's a complete failure to account for how somebody could generate that without having any external manifestations, sort of, or external injuries that happened while generating that force.
The analogy of dropping a baby from a 2-story building, obviously it was the fall that would have caused that infant's death. And I think that in, like Jeffrey's case, it was the fall.
Right.
The baby's head struck the toilet. There's a contusion on the back of that infant's head that was ignored because blinders were on, it was SBS, and that's the way it was. But I think that the underlying injuries, the other injuries that would need to be present, really need to be highlighted. We have a call. I'd like to go to a call here. We'll see who we have on the line. It's a 662 area code. Do you have a question or comment for Audrey?
Yeah, hi, it's Lori. How are you doing?
Hello, Lori.
Hi, thank you for calling.
I just wanted to ask you, I know you spent 11 years incarcerated, and I advocate for Jeff Havard, so, you know, he's almost 13 years. And I just want to know how you found the strength every day to keep positive, to keep moving forward, and not let it consume you.
There were moments when it totally consumed me, and I wish I could just go to sleep and not wake up until I was done with my prison time. It was not easy. It was not an easy lifestyle at all. To me, it's very, very inhumane. It's something I never got used to, and so it was very hard to continuously live in an environment that you can never get used to. And I was very, very fortunate to have a lot of outside contact. But you got to keep your faith, otherwise you will be destroyed. And it is hard. It's hard time. To this day, I can't mentally wrap my heart and emotions around it. I'm just thankful that I could get through it little by little.
Well, yeah, that's exactly the thing, because, you know, Jeff being on death row, those people are supposedly his peers, but they're not his peers. You know, just like you, the people that surrounded you were not your peers. You were innocent, and
and you shouldn't talk about your innocence with anybody, because so many people that are guilty, they just feel that everybody is guilty, and if you try to give them a story or try to think that they might want to confide in you, or you could be somebody's nice friend, I tell people it's really hard, but you've got to save yourself and your friends and anybody from the outside.
Wow.
When he has that problem. I think there's a lot of jealousy there because he didn't. In his case, well, I guess maybe they've already talked about it. There was no skull fracture. There was no, none of the injuries, rib fractures or anything to indicate that. They just had blinders on, and they decided that he did this, and because of that anal dilation, that he was guilty of sexual assault, and that was just it. And he was convicted in the ER, as much as he was in the courtroom.
Now, but I want to point out that Lori just made a very good point that he was convicted in the ER. The autopsy was done in Jeff's case within 24 hours. What Audrey's case points out, and what we're learning now, is that one of the most important things for the doctors to do when they're rendering or determining a cause and manner of death is to take a thorough look at the child's birth records and pediatric records. And if you look through the testimony in Jeff's case and the deposition of the pathologist, it doesn't appear that anybody ever really reviewed the child's birth records or pediatric records, because this is a child in Jeff's case who did have a traumatic birth, who was a vacuum delivery, which is notorious for causing subdural hematomas or hemorrhages right from birth. And those are the things that Audrey was talking about earlier, that while they normally will clear themselves up within 3 months or so, sometimes they don't. So if you've got a child that has a pre-existing condition, and that child is dropped, and that subdural hematoma ruptures, then something that is a very, an accidental fall, say, or something like that, all of a sudden, that action can produce a lethal result that wouldn't necessarily happen in a perfectly healthy child. And that's exactly what... Yes, exactly. And that's exactly what Dr. Ophoven suggested, among a number of other things, could have happened in this case. Now, she hasn't rendered a definitive, diagnosis, but except to say that this was not a shaking case. But, there are things like that were never even considered. It was the rush to judgment that Audrey was just talking about, where you've got the symptoms, you've got the triad. Let's look no further, and we've got our guy because he was the last person with her, and so now you've got a guy on death row. And when we stop and turn around and look at the pediatric records, I mean, you've got things like, she went in for 2 different sick visits within the month before her death. Sick visits. She had bronchitis at some point, an ear infection. She had, a number of different things. One of the things was that her head circumference, which they normally take, was in like the 97th percentile, and had increased, I think 4 times, whatever percent the increase was a red flag to something's going on. Is there, some extra pressure in the brain here? And this was never, ever looked at until recently. And this is some of the new evidence that the defense attorneys have raised in Jeff's case. So as far as she was diagnosed in the emergency room, absolutely. Should that have happened? There is no 3 symptoms that are diagnostic of shaken baby syndrome to the extent that you can find beyond a reasonable doubt and put a man on death row when you literally look no further.
Exactly.
Audrey's case is a perfect example of that.
Yes. The parents had called the hospital or taken the baby to the hospital or doctor 25 times in 27 weeks.
Oh, wow.
And yes, and that is one of the big things that many, many doctors have put out published articles about now, too, is that when these babies keep coming in for fussiness, the pediatricians, the ER doctors, anybody looking at them have got to quit just taking that little light and putting it in their eyes and nose and mouth. They've got to start doing a CT or an MRI, because Natalie went to the doctor the Thursday before she died, and God knows what they would have found if they would have done a CT or an MRI with the older and newer subdural hematoma inside of her head.
Wow.
Do you know,
and
Audrey,
they ignored
that's so funny
everything in your case.
Yeah. Just like in Jeff's case, she was 6 months old. The baby was 6 months old. She had never had a well baby checkup. She was always sick. She had been sick since birth. Basically, she had so many things go wrong with her. She had thrush, that mouth infection, and since she was 2 months old until the time she died.
The whole history of bad health that was completely ignored. We do have another call on the line, so I want to get to that before we get to the end of the show here. Thank you very much for calling in, Lori. You made some excellent points. Audrey's case is one of those cases that gives other people hope, because occasionally these do get corrected. Unfortunately, far too many that are not corrected. Her case does give us hope.
Yes, it does, and I appreciate all the doctors and the people that continue to persevere. As you can see with my case, it takes time. It takes a long, long time, and there's many examinees that have done a lot more time than me, but thankfully the medical and scientific field in this area is becoming more and more aware and willing to admit that there are changes and that the old science should not be applied. And for those that still want to apply it, there's enough good medical and scientific evidence, and it's not medical opinion, that will testify for those people that are wrongfully convicted. And I hope that more and more that have been wrongfully convicted will be released.
Those are excellent points. We're all hopeful right there with you. I want to get to this call. It's a 901 area code. You're on the air. Do you have a question or comment for Audrey?
Yes, thank you. Audrey, I missed the first part of the show, and I apologize, but I just wanted to ask you really quickly. If you've already said this, I truly apologize. But you said that you had a lot of support on the outside. Did you have that? Did you feel like you had that in the beginning of the case? And if not, where do you think your tipping point or your traction came?
I did. I'm very blessed with a big family of relatives, and the community that I was living in is very, very supportive. The ambulance doctor there was always on my side. The med flight doctor's been on my side, and I'm just more and more people are aware of this wrongful conviction, and they have spoken out and supported me, and I'm very, very thankful for that. It's been a great blessing for me. As hard as it was to go through it, those are the things that I have to keep my focus on. Otherwise, yes, I would be very angry and bitter, and it could have destroyed me, and I just can't let that happen. But thankfully, there is more and more support, and I'm reaching out through different Facebook sites and in any other way, as we're doing today, to try to help out others, to keep the hope, to keep persevering, to give them contacts of people that can possibly help with these wrongful cases.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much for the call. Now, Audrey, in recent years, with all of your advocacy efforts and the speaking engagements you've done, do you think we're headed in the right direction? Do you think many of these cases are going to be reviewed? Do you see a positive outlook in all of this?
I do. Just less than 2 weeks after this happened, there was one of the territory areas in Canada where one of their attorney generals up there had seen this outcome, and he ordered over 180 cases in his area to be reviewed, and this was 6 years ago. The UK is very, very big on new medical and scientific evidence and relooking at cases. We're starting to squeak into it in the United States. For some reason, in many areas, they just don't want to change, as we can see. But there is more and more conferences, like you said, speaking events that are looking into the wrongful conviction of shaken babies and the new medical and scientific evidence. So I do truly believe that it is going to help more people out.
I think also that it's something to point out is that everybody that has a hand in running the system is human, and we are going to make mistakes, and we're going to do it until the world finally comes to some crazy end. There are always going to be mistakes, and so the reluctance to even look at the possibility that there could have been a mistake, it's hard to really wrap my brain around because, we're human. We make mistakes. It's going to happen. And, if you're a prosecutor and you prosecute a shaken baby case, you're doing it because you've got a doctor that believes the child at one time was, believed that the child was shaken. And that's what you should do if that's what the evidence was. But that doesn't mean that it's not time now to turn around and say, wait a minute, if something went wrong, there's something that we can do about it to rectify, to fix it, and to make sure it doesn't happen again. And so I think that nobody's really trying to say all of these are really horrible people that have intentionally put innocent people in jail. Nobody's saying anything of the kind. But it's time to sort of step out of the tunnel and take a look and say, okay, maybe there's something wrong here, and maybe we should take a look.
That's right. As with many other medical cancers, other things, there's always new medical evidence, and the field is welcoming this. But for some reason, some doctors just don't want to look at the new medical science and evidence for shaken baby, and that I can't even try to figure that out.
Is there any chance that this is a generational issue? Are new doctors coming into the field going to be more open to looking at the current technologies and the current evidence available?
I certainly think that they will. I think that it's not even necessarily a problem only with the medical community. I think the problem is also with the appellate system. For example, and to go back to Jeff Havard's case, we've got 5 independent experts that have looked at the case pro bono. Nobody made any money off of it, and they only looked at it pro bono because it's such a serious case because he's now on death row. All 5 of them have said, not that this could have been something other than shaking. All 5 of them have said this was not shaking. And the one doctor that testified on behalf of the state against Jeff at the time of trial has now said, you know what, advances in medical science have now caused me to change my opinion. While he's not saying that, this was definitely accidental, he's saying that what he testified to at trial is essentially wrong, that the child could not have died of shaken alone. But yet Jeff is still sitting on death row. The problem is that the state's objecting to overturning his conviction because the state is saying, well, all of those experts they held that same opinion around the time of Jeff's trial in 2002. So they all could have testified to that at trial. So it's not new evidence. The problem being that at Jeff's trial, he wasn't allowed to call his own expert. So they might have held that opinion, but they couldn't have testified at his trial. And isn't the question, or shouldn't the question be, is this new evidence, but is this evidence of innocence? And the answer is clearly yes, because if you're going to try the case over today, there isn't a single medical expert that I'm aware of that's looked at this case that said, oh, this child was definitely shaken. So it's a problem with the legal system catching up with the medical system as far as it's so, and Audrey knows better probably than anybody, it's so difficult to undo a wrongful conviction once it happens. You've literally got to get out there and you've got to get just the right evidence lined up, and all the stars have to align correctly in order for the court to find that, you've got to essentially prove your innocence, which is almost an impossibility. So there's got to be changes made in the way we look at the cases, but also there's got to be changes in the way that in the opportunities that we afford people to, make their case that they're wrongfully convicted.
Absolutely. It seems like we're moving in the right direction, but that direction is moving very, very slowly. And for people that are currently in prison, it's just painstaking. I can't imagine living through that day to day. And look at Audrey's case. It took 11 years, and she did have support. It just took a great deal of time. It took 4 years after there was a break in her case to actually set her free. We're seeing trials take days to complete, and it takes years to correct. So hopefully, not only are we going to work to correct the wrongful convictions, but we're also going to work to get the information out there so new convictions don't occur on faulty science. As we wrap up the show here tonight, Audrey, I know that you are on the advisory board for Investigating Innocence. That's investigatiingnocence.org, an organization founded by Bill Clutter. It's a great group of people. I recommend that website. Is there any other organizations you would like to recommend for people to take a look at to learn a little bit more about SBS?
The Center of Wrongful Convictions out of Chicago Northwestern is a wonderful group that I'm a part of. And just Googling Shaken Baby, they can get all kinds of information on that, or looking at the National Registration for Exoneree, and they will be amazed at wrongful conviction. And just pulling up Shaken Baby, and there is a Shaken Baby website also on Facebook.
Yep. There's also a website.
So much more.
There's a website by a woman, I believe her name is Sue Lutner, and the website is on SBS. It's just ON and then SBS. And for anybody that doesn't really have any sort of legal or medical background, it's such a phenomenal site. She does just such a wonderful job of taking all of these complex legal and medical articles and sort of,
simplifying them.
Exactly. And it's just it's a wonderful site, and so I'd highly recommend that to anybody else out there.
Excellent site.
Very good. Well, I want to thank you both for being on tonight. Jen, as always, we always appreciate your insight. And Audrey, for coming on tonight to talk about your story and get this information out to the public. We can't appreciate it more. Thank you so much for being on.
Thank you for all the awareness and support. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, Audrey.
Thanks,
Bruce.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good night. Tonight, I would really like to recommend that you go to Amazon.com. You can search Audrey Edmunds. That's Edmunds. And you'll find her book there. I recommend that for everybody. Her story really needs to be heard. As always, visit injustice-anywhere.org for information on future shows. Thank you for tuning in.